Next from Springfield, we hear a presentation on the process of redrawing political boundaries known as redistricting. This is done every 10 years following a census, but many believe the current process is not fair and is controlled too much by political parties. This runs about 50 minutes.
Before we get to all that, I'd like to ask Dr. Charlie Leonard, who's a political scientist here at the Institute and who supervises our statewide and Southern Illinois regional polling, to come forward and give us an overview of how citizens view redistricting and reform efforts. Charlie?
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted you've joined us here today. I want to give us a quick summary of what our polling has found over time regarding two specific redistricting reforms that we've been asking about for some time. I'll open with a nickel tour of the status quo, and then we'll dive into two survey questions that we've been asking since 2009 and 2010. The courts and state laws say that districts must be compact and contiguous. In other words, you could walk from one part of the district to any other part without leaving it. Contiguous is a precise term. You can tell when a district is contiguous or not. Apparently, looking at Illinois districts, you can't tell what compact means. Some of them look like a bug on a windshield. And good redistricting preserves communities of interest. It apportions legislative districts that have things in common with each other, and stretched out, funny-looking, spidery, gerrymandered district probably doesn't preserve communities of interest and apportion legislators to groups that have things in common with each other. About half of the state's laws and constitutions in their redistricting provisions mention communities of interest. Our state does not. And as David said, and as other panelists will probably address, we assert that safe partisan districts cause incumbents to worry about primary election challenges, and primary voters are more partisan and more extreme in their partisanship as a group than our general election voters. In our current system in Illinois, if the legislature can't agree on a map, redistricting goes to an 8-member commission with members appointed by the legislative leaders of both parties. And as usually happens, there's a partisan tie, 4-4. This last happened in 2001. If there's a partisan tie, each party draws its own map, and then the winning party is the name drawn out of Lincoln's hat. And that encourages the parties to draw the most partisan map possible because there's no reason to compromise. Either my name will get drawn from the hat or it won't, and if it didn't get drawn, it didn't hurt me to draw the most partisan map, and if I do get picked, yay. So the first reform that we've been asking about in our surveys for 5 years now is for the Supreme Court to add a neutral person, a 9th neutral person of the Redistricting Commission in the case of a partisan tie. And that would encourage the sides to draw a more moderate map that could draw the vote of that 9th member. We've been asking about this since 2009. Let me throw some results up here for us to look at. I can't resist the Phil Donahue thing. My students don't know who Phil Donahue is. So I have to say I'm doing the Oprah thing, and it's just incongruous for them. We can see going back to 2009, that's the dots on the far left, the bright blue line is strongly favoring this reform to add a neutral person. And the green line is the percentage simply favoring it. And we can see some movement over time. 70–80% in 2009 and 2010 favored it. But in 2011, the lines converge so that the percentage of people strongly favoring has gone up a lot. Something happened between 2010 and 2011 for the intensity of favoring this reform to have gone up and to have stayed about the same. Let's not overinterpret those little bounces in 2011, 12, and 13, because that's probably just statistical margin for error fluctuation. So sometime in 2011, the intensity of support for this reform has gone up. We ask about a lot of different political reforms in our poll. We weren't so prescient in 2009 to know that we'd be doing this here today. Another thing we've done with these numbers is for the past 3 years to break out the percentage favoring these reforms by Chicago, Chicago suburbs, and downstate. If you're not from Illinois, downstate means not Chicago and the suburbs. So downstate can mean Galena to Cairo. I want to caution you not to overinterpret any fluctuation in these favorabilities over time, because the subsamples are small and margins for error will be high. But what I want to point out here is that large majorities in Chicago, in the Chicago suburbs, and in downstate favor this neutral person reform. And the support has been high and remained high for the past 3 years. We've done the same by the party of our respondents, and again, for the last 3 years, support is high and remains high among Democrats and Republicans. And Democrats, at least for the time being, would probably be disadvantaged by these reforms. In another few cycles, it might be the Republicans. But even among Democrats, essentially 3/4 favor this reform. The second one, and what we'll probably hear a lot more about today, is the independent remap panel that draws a map for the legislature and the governor to approve. We've been testing this one since 2010. And you can see a similar thing happening between 2010 and 2011. That blue line, the percent strongly favoring that reform, has gone up, and we're at 70-ish% total favor. But again, intensity has gone up in between those 2 years and stayed high. And similarly, for this second reform, the independent remap panel, across geography, favorability starts high and remains high. Again, we don't want to make assertions about whether that bouncing up and down is significant. Particularly that 2013 poll only had 600 respondents. So we're confident in that 600 number, but in subgroups out of that 600, the margin for error will be high. And again, by party, large majorities favor the independent remap panel. Support starts high and stays high. So in a nutshell, as long as we've been testing these for 5 or 4 years, large majorities have favored these reforms. We assert that the intensity of support grew between 2010 and 2011 and is sustained, and that support for reform remains strong among regional and partisan subgroups. So perhaps the time is ripe. That's what I brought, folks. Thank you. I'd be happy to take a question. I have a couple minutes. Yes, sir.
Just one regarding the data from with you favor the proposal for the neutral member.
Yes.
What happened to the independents between 2012 and 2015?
somebody has my cheat sheet there and wants to know what happened to the independent support for the Remap panel between 2012 and 2013, there's probably not 100 independents in that sample, so that's probably statistical noise.
It just seems like such a dramatic number.
Yeah, but there's 600 in the total sample. There's not 100 independents in that sample. So if 5 or 7 of them are cranky that day, it can skew that number. Yes, and then you.
Have you ever polled on multi-member district cumulative voting systems?
We have not polled on multi-member cumulative voting systems. That's a hard thing to poll on because the question is complicated, and trying to explain that to somebody that's just away from Wheel of Fortune and on the phone and trying to explain how that works is difficult. We might try it someday if it ever becomes viable, but it hasn't come up, so we haven't polled on it. Yes, sir.
So I just wanted to ask, and you may have mentioned this, forgive me, is this registered voters or likely voters? Do you think it makes a difference?
We survey registered voters in all of our polls. As a policy institute, we are less interested in election outcomes, though we do sometimes throw horse race questions on there just because we're nerds and it's fun. And figuring out who the likely voters are is a really imprecise science. Ask Gallup from this last polling. So we have tried a likely voter model a time or two in the past. It probably would make a difference, but it's a lot of work and it's pretty speculative. That's a good question. Anyone else before you let off the hook? Thank you for your time. Gonna bring Morgan up.
Thank you, Charlie. Our first keynote speaker is Morgan Cullen from the National Conference of State Legislatures in Denver. He is the NCSL's leading expert on redistricting questions. He was also of enormous help to me in putting together this symposium, in identifying the best people we could get to come here and calling them up and encouraging them to be here. And so I want to thank him particularly for his generosity in suggesting these experts and for helping us develop this program. I also want to thank him for spending his time making this trek out here. Morgan?
So when I think David called me several months ago and he said, he told me about that he's trying to put this whole conference together, and and he said, "Oh, I really appreciate your help." I said, "Well, are you kidding me? Like, I thought I was going to have to wait 8 years before I get to do something like this again. So this is a rare treat, and I really appreciate you inviting me here. And it's good to see a lot of familiar faces. And so, if I can make a quick plug for the organization that I work for, real quick, it's the National Conference of State Legislatures. We're a 50-state organization that all 50 states pay dues into. We provide a variety of different services. One, we do a lot of policy analysis. We do a lot of professional development. Do a lot of training on behalf of state legislatures at the federal level. So do a variety of different things. Cover a variety of different issue areas, not just elections and redistricting. So I'd encourage anybody to jump on our website if you need to get any information, or if you need any additional information on redistricting after the meeting or the conference is over. I give you a card or whatever, and I'd be happy to assist you as well. So one of the publications that we put together, as you all know, redistricting is governed by a voluminous body of state and federal law. This is just one publication that we put together every 10 years, Redistricting Law 2010. My colleague Peter Watson, who is the former Secretary of the Minnesota State Senate, was actually the editor-in-chief, and he's been involved in NCSL for a really long time. So I try to start with something funny, and I like this cartoon a lot because I think there's a lot of truth to it. There's two people at a museum. One's looking at abstract art, The other one's looking at a political redistricting map, and the caption under it is, what makes you wonder what's going through their minds, doesn't it? And I think there is a lot of truth to it. You know, when you look at a redistricting map and you see all the bizarre looking shapes and contorted boundaries and, you know, on the face of it, it doesn't make a lot of sense at all. But when you get down to it, and you start to learn the rules of the game, you start to realize that there is a method to the madness, and there is a reason that the districts are drawn the way that they are. And so I guess that's really the purpose of this presentation today, is to kind of give you a general overview of the process, what all states have to do when they go to redraw their maps every 10 years. And then also look at some of the specific differences between the states. You know, all states are constitutionally mandated to redistrict every 10 years, but not all states have to go about it in the same manner. So we're going to look at some of those differences as well. And then this is a conference about redistricting reform. So we're going to also look at some of the reform measures that other states have taken in recent years and learn more about those as well. So again, we're going to do an overview of the redistricting process. What is redistricting? We'll start with the basics. Why do we redistrict? When do we redistrict? Who is in charge of drawing the lines? Where do we redistrict? How do we redistrict? And so what? Who cares?
Morgan, you can hand hold that mic if it's more comfortable.
Okay. There. Okay, I'll be good.
All right.
So does anybody know the difference? Here's two terms that are commonly confused with one another, and it's not just, you know, everybody can be confused. See, in my home state of Colorado, the State Legislative Redistricting Commission is actually not the Redistricting Commission, it's actually the Reapportionment Commission. It's misnamed. But anyway, does anybody know the difference between redistricting and reapportionment?
Apportionment is the allocation of the number of seats, for example, out of the 435 congressional seats based on population shifts, and redistricting is then drawing the lines for that number of seats within your state.
So that's correct. The redistricting is the actual process of redrawing the lines to meet those equal population requirements. Reapportionment is the reallocation of congressional states, the 435 seats in Congress, so that each state has the proper allocation based on population changes that have occurred over the 10-year period as determined by the U.S. Census. So, and I have prizes for people that, if you get a right answer, you get a prize.
Thank you.
It's like 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm giving out candy bars, but yeah, that's the best I could do. So why do we redistrict? Does anybody know the answer to that? We redistrict because we're constitutionally mandated to redistrict. For about over 150 years, state legislatures had complete authority over the redistricting process with very little oversight from the courts or the federal government. And then in 1962, in a Supreme Court case, Baker versus Carr, the Supreme Court ruled that they did have jurisdiction to question challenges for redistricting maps. And then that, coupled with a couple of other cases, Gary versus Sanders, Rendell versus Sims, which established that one person, one vote principle, ushered in what is commonly referred to today as the Modern Redistricting Era. So what does that mean? It means that every 10 years, state legislatures have to go about redistricting, or states have to go about redistricting, and they have to meet those equal population requirements. And the courts have ruled that for Congress, that means as little deviation as possible, basically zero deviation. And then state legislatures, you can have up to 10% deviation, but that's for good reason. So when do we redistrict? Just to kind of give an overview of the last 2010 redistricting cycle, the census was taken in 2010. Once all that information was put together, was delivered to the president in December. And then after that, in late December, information was given to the states about reapportionment, whether or not they're going to be gaining or losing a congressional seat. And then after that, the Census Bureau started rolling out the PL 94-171 files, basically all the information that the states need in order to begin the redistricting process. And then the final deadline for that was April 1st. So they started to roll this information out to states on an as-needed basis. So obviously states, they don't all go about redistricting the same way. Well, they also don't go about elections in the same manner as well. So 4 states had 2011 legislative elections, not 2012 elections, so they got their information first. Does anybody know what states those are? It's, I'll just give a candy bar to myself. Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Virginia all have off-year state legislative elections. So they got that information first. Louisiana was the first state to receive the information. And then some states, like Maine and Montana, actually have state constitutional provisions that say that they will not redraw the lines for the election immediately following the census count. They'll wait another 2 years. And so they're actually in the process of still drawing their lines right now. Montana's finished, Maine hasn't finished yet for state legislative lines. And then 2 states don't have legislative elections until 2014. And the reason for that is that both the House and the Senate both serve 4-year terms, and they're not staggered terms at all. So both chambers are up for re-election. Does anybody know what states those are? It's Maryland and Alabama are those states. So they'll be running in their new state legislative districts for the first time in 2014 as well. So a progress report. Maine is just going through the process of redrawing their lines. And then Kentucky actually passed a plan, but the state Supreme Court actually struck their plan down. And so the legislature then had to go back and redraw their maps. Basically, the court said that they didn't meet equal population requirements, and then they unnecessarily divided political subdivisions. So the House has just recently passed another plan. It hasn't been approved by the Senate yet. So they still don't have a state legislative plan. And then there's still lawsuits pending in 13 different states. So it's 2013 now, and redistricting process still isn't over. So where do we draw the lines? Reapportionment. What we saw, as far as reapportionment is concerned, we saw 2 things happen. We saw a migration of people from the Northeast and the Midwest to the South and Southwest. And then we also just saw a massive explosion in minority growth, basically Latino growth. Latino growth accounted for 50% of the entire growth that occurred over the last 10 years in the United States. Do you know what state gained the most congressional seats in this last round of reapportionment? After the, yeah. Texas gained 4 congressional seats. Does anybody know who came in second place? Florida gained 2. Does anybody know? We'll do census trivia because it's like. Does anybody know what 2 states lost more than 1 congressional seat?
Pennsylvania.
You're right about New York. In Ohio, who said that? Yeah. All right. You guys aren't allowed to play anymore. So. So does anybody know what state had the largest rate of growth in the last 10 years? Rate of growth. It's Nevada. They grew by 35%. Very large. And then the state with the largest numeric increase, that one should be easy. Yeah. What was their rate of, or what was their, how rapidly, or how much did their population increase in the last 10 years? 4.5 million people. So it's huge. The only two states that kind of don't really fit into the equation is Louisiana, and they didn't lose population. They actually had a net gain, but didn't grow as rapidly as possible just due to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And then Washington State, which is kind of an enigma to me. I'm not quite sure why they grew as fast as they did compared to other states in the region. Does anybody know what state was the only state to lose population in the last 10 years? It's Michigan. And they lost population 0.5%. I heard it back there, but I'm not giving you any more candy bars. So, yeah, it was Michigan was the only state to actually lose population. One state became, for the first time, a majority-minority state. For the first time. California is a majority-minority state, but they were a majority-minority state before Texas, yeah. So Texas joined Hawaii, California, New Mexico, and then Washington, D.C. are all majority-minority states. So who draws the lines? In 37 states, the ultimate responsibility for redistricting resides with the legislature. And then in 13 others, they have a primary commission where a border commission will actually redraw the lines. And then there's also commissions for congressional redistricting as well in 7 states. And then we also have advisory commissions that make formal recommendations to the legislature. We have backup commissions that kick in, like there's one actually here in Illinois that kicks in if the legislature fails to enact a plan. We have the Iowa model, which is completely unique to any other state, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then we have the courts. The courts play a major role in the redistricting process. So far, there's been 197 lawsuits in 40 different states. So I've heard it said in one of our previous conferences that every 10 years, redistricting lawsuits, they're like death and taxes. They're one of the certainties in life. So anyway, and then some states actually have a mandatory review process, and that's the case in Kansas, Colorado, and Florida. So before a plan can pass, the Supreme Court will review the plans to make sure that it's a legal plan. So this is just a slide just showing the different commissions. The states in yellow are the primary commissions. The states in green are the backup commissions. And then the states in yellow are the advisory commissions. And let's get, I kind of did another slide for you guys just to kind of get into some more detail since we're going to be talking about specifically Florida, New Jersey, and Arizona, and California today. So I thought we'd kind of just go through and look at how some of these different commissions are structured. So one state that has a completely unique commission is New Jersey. And the reason that they're unique is that the two major political parties, the chair of each political party actually selects the members to serve on the commission. So the Democratic Party chair will select 5 members. The Republican Party chair selects 5 members. And then there's also the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will select the 11th member to serve on the commission. And then it's just a simple majority vote to enact a plan. But no other state has a selection process quite like that. So that's completely unique to New Jersey. And then we also have some backup states with backup commissions, and they're structured in a variety of different ways. You have states like Connecticut and Illinois, where legislative leadership will pick the members to serve on the commission. Then you have states like Texas and Mississippi, where statewide elected officials like the state treasurer, the attorney general serve on the commission. And then you have states, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is kind of a hybrid of both. The lieutenant governor serves on the commission, and then also designees, legislative leadership will select members to serve in the commission, and then the governor will also select some members to serve in the commission as well. And then we have advisory commissions, and these basically they just make formal recommendations to the legislature, and they vary in the level of their responsibility. For example, in Maine, they actually draw maps and propose maps to the legislature. And then in states like Iowa, they actually basically just go out and set up public forums so that the citizens can get involved, and they receive public comment and then actually give that information to nonpartisan staff who then draws the lines. So it varies on the level of their responsibility. Then we have independent commissions, and we actually have 2 commissioners here today that served on both the California Commission and then also on the Arizona Commission. And these are unique in that they're made up entirely of registered voters within the state. And the legislature actually has a very limited role in the selection process. So for example, in Arizona, it's the Commission on Appellate Court of Appointees that actually creates a 25 pool of applicants. So there has to be 10 Democrats, 10 Republicans, and then 5 from neither party. And then legislative leadership can actually select the members. And so the majority party and the minority party will each select 2 members so for a total of 4. And then those 4 commissioners will get together and select the 5th member. But that 5th member can't be of any political persuasion of any other member that's currently on the commission. So that's typically that independent commission member will be that 5th member. So we'll talk more about California in a bit. And then we've got politician and politician-appointed commissions. So we have politician commissions, which is what you've got in Ohio. And that basically it's the governor, the auditor, the secretary of state, and the presiding officers of both chambers make up that 5-member commission. And then you've also got politician-appointed commissions, which is what of something you'd see in Washington, where the majority and minority leaders from both chambers will each select a member for a total of 4, and then those 4 commission members will get together and select a 5th non-voting member that serves basically just as the commission's chair. And then you have states where there's total legislative control. What I mean by this is they're not subject to the governor's veto. There's one other state that I forgot to mention that's pretty unique too, and that it's the exact opposite, and that's Maryland. In Maryland, usually redistricting plan goes through the legislative process the same way any bill does, right? You draw up the plans, they have to enact them in both chambers, and then the governor will sign them into law. In Maryland, it's the exact opposite. The governor has his own advisory commission. He does the plan, he enacts it, and then it actually goes to the legislature, and they can't overturn it without a supermajority vote. So the executive branch actually has control of redistricting, not the legislature in Maryland. So there you go. We'll talk a little bit more about California. California, and I just wanted to bring this one up because it's very new. In 2008 and then in 2010, California voters approved Proposition 11 and Proposition 20, which transferred redistricting authority from the legislature to a 14-member commission that's made up entirely of registered voters within the state. And the primary authority for the selection process begins with the state auditor's office. And so they have a pool of 60 members of qualified applicants that they assemble. And then legislative leadership has an opportunity to reduce the pool, but it's not by very much. I think it's, they can only discard about 2 or 3 members. And then when they have that original pool taken, or that original pool is reduced, then the state auditor's office again will select 8 members to serve on the commission, but it's through a random lottery. So their hands are tied as well. And then after that, those 8 commissioners will pick the remaining 6. So there's a total of 14. But they have to be 5 Republicans, there has to be 5 Democrats, and then 4 from neither party. And then to enact a redistricting plan, you have to have a supermajority. But it's not just a supermajority. You need to have a supermajority, but you need to have votes. You need to have at least 3 votes that are Democrat, at least 3 votes that are Republican, and then at least 3 votes from neither party. Then we have the Iowa model, which is very unique well, in that the legislature isn't responsible for it, for redistricting. It's not a commission that draws the lines. It's actually nonpartisan staff, and they are prohibited from looking at any incumbent addresses or political data at all when they go to redraw their maps. And they have 3 opportunities to draw maps. The first opportunity, they'll present it to the legislature, and the legislature has to either accept it or strike it down. They can't amend the maps in any way. If they do strike it down, then it goes back to nonpartisan staff, and they'll redraw the plans again. And then it's the exact same process. They can't amend the plans in any way. It's just a simple up or down and vote. And then if they strike it down again, then they go back to a 3rd time. The 3rd time they are allowed to amend the plans. And then if still the proposed plans don't pass, then it actually goes to the state Supreme Court. And then they'll draw the lines. But yeah, very interesting process. You see a much higher rate of incumbent turnover in Iowa than you do in any other state. For the 150 members that serve in the legislature, I think 42 of them were paired together this redistricting cycle. And then for congressional seats, they think 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans were paired together as well. So much higher rate of incumbent turnover. And then you have the legislature, and I like this slide a lot. I'll let you guys kind of draw your own conclusions. But basically, this is kind of the legislative control of U.S. congressional seats following the 2010 election. And what you see is the Republican Party just has a huge advantage over the redistricting process for congressional seats compared to Democrats. And the comment that I would make is that elections matter, and elections matter a lot when redistricting immediately follows. And in the 2010 elections, Republicans cleaned house. They won over 675 seats, picked up 19 chambers, and actually had unilateral control over 25 chambers nationwide. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to get into specifics about the outcome of the 2012 elections, but it was actually the exact opposite. Actually, Democrats had won a clear majority of the vote, the popular vote for congressional seats nationwide, yet Republicans still maintain a 33-seat majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. And all the seats are getting a lot safer as well. I was reading an article on fairvotes.org that said there's only really 21 state congressional seats out of the 435 total seats in the U.S. Congress that are really up for grabs, and that's between 5% margin of error. So the seats are getting safer. So how do we redistrict? We've already talked about population equality. Now we'll talk a bit about complying with the Voting Rights Act. We'll talk a bit about traditional redistricting principles and technology and software. So the Voting Rights Act. Basically, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act says that if minorities are in sufficient numbers and live in a specific or concentrated geographical location, you cannot dilute the minority vote. You need to create a majority minority district. And so these are the central questions that you ask. Do minorities represent most of the voters in a concentrated area? Do voters tend to vote for different candidates, minorities? And then is the minority population otherwise protected given the totality of the circumstances? If that's the case, then you have to draw a majority minority district. So let's take a look and see what this actually looks like. You guys familiar with this district at all? Affectionately known as the Earmuff District. That's Lake Michigan there to the east. Does anybody know what district this is for a chocolate bar? What's that? That's correct. So this district was drawn basically as a majority minority district. Is represented by Luis Gutierrez. I think it's Cook County. It's basically the only way that the district maintains contiguity is to Highway 294 to the west. And it was written in Economist magazine, written up in Economist magazine as one of the most strangely drawn districts in the country. But there really was a reason behind it. And what you see is to the north you have a large concentrated population of Puerto Rican Americans. To the south you have a large concentration of Mexican Americans. And then in the middle you have a large concentration of African Americans. And so the idea behind it was let's connect these two districts, create a majority-minority Hispanic district, and then leave the 7th Congressional District in the middle as an African-American majority-minority district, and that's what they did. These two districts were created actually after the 2000 round of redistricting, but I think they're still the same. They pretty much intact today after the 2010 round of redistricting. And then you also have Section 5 states, and basically Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is reserved for states that have shown a history of voter discrimination in their election laws. And what you have is some states are completely covered under Section 5, and some states there's just certain jurisdictions. But the requirement there is that they've got to file for pre-clearance with the Department of Justice prior to having their plans approved. And so what that means, once their plans are enacted, they have to submit them either to the Department of Justice or DC District Court, and then it can take up to 120 days before they get final approval of their plans. So they're on a much stricter timetable as well. There's one state up here that shouldn't be. Does anybody know which state that is? So the answer is correct. They actually used to be a covered jurisdiction. There was a series of municipalities that were in New Hampshire, but they actually just filed and were given bailout, so they're no longer a covered jurisdiction. So.
Give the candy bar to the young man who would want to breathe it
So. Central questions for Section 5 is the new map intended to dilute minority votes, and then does the map leave minority voters worse off? and that's called retrogression. If that's the case, you could have a potential Section 5 violation, and your plans may not pass. So those are the 2 state requirements. You have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. You have to meet equal population requirements. After that, as we heard from the previous speaker, there's a series of state laws as well. Those are known as traditional redistricting principles. These are the 4 main traditional redistricting principles. The first one's contiguity. And that basically just means that all parts of a district need to be connected to each other, or just to put it another way, you need to be able to move from one district to another without having to enter into a neighboring district. So it's pretty straightforward. It can get a little bit more complicated, I guess, when water is involved in the process. Typically, if there's a bridge that connects 2 land masses together, you consider that contiguous. Or if islands are paired with the closest neighboring district on the mainland, that would also be considered contiguous as well. Political boundaries. 48 states require contiguity for legislative districts, and 23 states require it for congressional districts. Political boundaries, or preserving political subdivisions, basically means that counties, wards, cities, parishes have to be kept whole or nested within a district for the district to be a legal plan. And 46 states require that for state legislative districts, and 20 states require that for congressional districts. Then you have compactness, and compactness basically has to do with the appearance of a district. It says that states have to maintain, their districts have to maintain a conventional appearance for them to be legal, and if there's any kind of contorted, bizarre looking shapes that come out of a district, that usually raises a red flag of a possible political or racial gerrymander. So it's really just the appearance of a district. 38 states for state legislative districts and 19 states for congressional districts. And then finally you have communities of interest. And it's a very loosely defined, very broad term that simply means that there's shared priorities, values or interests of a given community in a geographic location. And that can mean a variety of different things. They can be economic communities of interest, or social, racial, demographic. It really can be a variety of different things.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.